Hey, welcome back. I'd like to take you this week on a little trip down memory lane, a personal story for me, but one that might relate to you too. I just recently made a trip to one of my favorite airports on the entire planet, Gainesville, Florida. Gainesville is someplace you might think of as the home of the University of Florida, go Gators, or maybe the boyhood home of Tom Petty and most of the Heartbreakers. And that's true. But it's also the home of the University Air Center, and that's why I went up for the Gator Fly-in and Armed Services Appreciation Day. I'm going to tell you the story. But first, like, subscribe, share, you know the whole thing you can do. We appreciate it, and I'm glad you're here. Gainesville Airport is really near and dear to my heart because the first commercial flight I ever took as a 4-year-old boy flew into Gainesville, Florida. Believe it or not, my brother and I traveled unaccompanied on Eastern Airlines when I was 4 and he was about to turn 6 with connecting flights in Atlanta. Yes, we had weird parents. But Gainesville was our destination. It's still a wonderful airport, but what's really unique about it is what was the Eastern Airline Terminal is now the University Air Center FBO building. It's a terrific place, and I'm so glad the folks that operate that place have done this regular annual Gator Fly-in and Armed Services Appreciation Day where they bring people in from all over Gainesville and Alachua County to enjoy what general aviation can be. Now, a little bit of personal history and how we can all intersect with real history in some way. Gainesville Airport was at one time known as John Allison Airport. John Allison was a pilot from the area. He was born in Micanopy. He went off with the U.S. Army to fly the replacements for the Flying Tigers in China in World War II. He was a really impressive guy with a remarkable career. But what's interesting to me about my family connection with him is how I got into aviation directly connects to John Allison. Back in the 1940s, my dad lived in Daytona Beach. He was just a little kid. And my grandmother, Queenie Bell Beckett, used to play cards with the woman across the street, Mrs. Allison. Mrs. Allison's son was supposedly a Flying Tiger. He was actually a U.S. Army pilot who relieved the Flying Tigers. But my dad would play on the floor with these little pop metal airplanes that John had left behind. And it's the same John Allison who Gainesville Airport was named after. This is where it gets a little weird. Years later, after my dad had been a fighter pilot in the Air Force and went to Pan Am, he actually was part of a crew that set a record for around the world over the poles. It was called Pan Am 50. Pan American 50th anniversary, they loaded up a 747 SP, special performance, and flew a route that went over the North and South Poles around the whole world, I believe in 49 hours and change. There were some stops in there for refueling and that sort of thing. But he still holds that record. You can look it up in the record books. My dad's name is still in there. First Officer Stuart Beckett was on that crew. Now, when you set a world record in aviation, a plaque comes to you from the Fédération Aéronautique, French organization. But the president of the Fédération Aéronautique at that time was a guy named John Allison. And I actually was lucky enough to be talking to Tex Hill, the Flying Tiger, on the phone, finished up our business, and I said, hey, do you know a guy named John Allison? Because I wondered, is the John Allison whose family my granny and my dad used to hang out with way back when, is that the same John Allison that signed this form for my dad, the plaque that still hangs in my parents' house today? Well, Tex Hill's like, sure, I got his number. You want it? I called John Allison up. He's 93 years old at his desk in Washington, D.C. This is several years ago. John is gone now. But if you're ever at the Spartanburg, South Carolina airport, his picture's right there on the wall with a little blurb about who he was and what he did. He was a remarkable guy. Today, Gainesville Airport is more commonly known as Gainesville Regional Airport, but there is still a John Allison Avenue that runs right to the terminal building. And you know, I just get a kick out of it. My dad was inspired to fly by John Allison's toys at his house and the stories of this flying tiger. And obviously, I grew up in that household. I was influenced and learned to fly largely because of my dad's story. So there is a direct line from John Allison to my dad, to me, to Gainesville Regional Airport, which is where I spent some time recently. Now, back in the old days, and by old days I mean 1962, when I first flew into Gainesville on Eastern Airlines, the University Air Center building, what is now the FBO, was the Eastern Airlines terminal. There's a picture right here of a Connie just a few years before that on the ramp outside that building, and you can see the World War II maintenance hangar there. That's where they used to maintain P-51 Mustangs. That's what flew out of that base. That hangar is still there, and that building is where the University Air Center Flight School is today. Now, back then, when we flew in on Eastern Airlines, they would very often bring out these stairs. Jetways didn't exist yet. The buildings were quite small. This one was built in 1955, long before jet service was common in the United States. So what would happen is people would walk out of the terminal building across the ramp to a stairway and climb up into the airplane. Or when you got there, some line guy would position that stairway outside the airplane and you'd climb down those steps. Those steps, the same steps that now have the Gator emblem on them and are still used today when a large military airplane like this one flies in, I walked down those exact steps when I was 4 years old. Right up through my teen years, that was the common way to fly into Gainesville and get off the darn airplane. It's all changed now, but that means a lot to me because that's my personal history. A little bit later, when I learned to fly and I got serious and I really started racking up the ratings and certificates, I got my initial instructor rating at Gainesville Regional Airport. I flew with a guy named Dewey Oliver, who actually was a pilot for the University of Florida, a great designated examiner. I have such fond memories from this guy. They're not supposed to teach, but I learned so much about the demeanor of a CFI and a DPE, and just a highly qualified pilot who's overseeing somebody else, from the way Dewey conducted the oral exam and the flight we went on. It was just a great experience, and all of this wraps up to give me a huge emotional connection to Gainesville Regional Airport. All of that brings us up to modern times, and the whole reason I was at Gainesville recently. I went to attend the Gator Fly-in and Armed Services Appreciation Day, an annual event they hold there that's just fantastic. Not because it's so massive or because anything really incredible happens. It's because it's so open, it's so friendly. It's just a classic case of Southern charm and hospitality. People come out from all around the area. People fly in with their own planes. I ran into my old buddy Aaron, who's actually a U.S. Navy officer attached to a ship, but his love is of flying, and he's got this spectacular champ that's been in his family forever. I also met a bunch of new friends there, and it's always a worthwhile trip because I'm interested in aviation, they're interested in aviation, there are family members who have some kind of interest, even little kids who run around and they're just into it. Everything about this is just terrific. From the food trucks, to the exhibitors inside the hangar, to the airplanes out on the ramp, it's just remarkable. And University Air Center deserves a real tip of the hat because they've hosted this year after year. And they're such a unique place. A family-owned FBO, in business since 1989. The second generation, Zach, runs the facility now. He does a wonderful job, very amiable guy. I really enjoyed talking with him on the ramp. Pam runs the flight school and does an outstanding job because unlike a lot of small Part 61 flight schools, the University of Air Center Flight School has the opportunity to not only employ you as a flight instructor if you finish your ratings there and are serious about a career, they also run Cessna Caravans throughout the Southeast every night except Thanksgiving and Christmas. And they pick up blood samples to bring them back to the hospital for testing. They also have a corporate jet that they use for organ transplant work, where they fly doctors and nurses out and fly doctors and nurses back with donated organs. This is one of those things that makes University Air Center a really uniquely diversified company, but still with that very homey family feel where you can just walk right up to the president or the head of the flight school or anybody else and say, hey, I'm wondering about this. What's my career path? How do I get to that step? And they'll talk to you. Any flight school can do this, but University Air Center actually does. So whether we're talking about my personal history, flying in there, my grandparents picking my little brother and I up, well, he's actually my older brother, but still, we were 4 and 5 years old. We were pretty little. Or whether it's my buddy Steve, my next door neighbor, who worked there in the high school years and worked for Martin Caden, the author who had a Ju-52 called Iron Annie. Or whether it was this most recent trip up for the Gator Fly-in and Armed Services Appreciation Day. There's always a good reason for me to go to Gainesville Airport. And if you're anywhere in Florida, there's a good reason for you to go there too. But that's not the big point of this. The big point is there's an airport near you. There is probably a general aviation airport not far from wherever you are right now watching this video. And that airport has some history and it has people connected to it. There's an entire community and a regional history that connects directly to that airport, and you can be a part of it. Whether you're a teenager just getting involved in aviation, if you're a middle-aged business person just getting involved in aviation, or if you're a senior captain for a major airline that just wants to get out there and fly a Cub or a Champ around the paddock every once in a while, you can be a part of the community at your local area, and you have no idea what can happen in terms of education, inspiration, motivation, community benefit when people like you get involved at your local airport. Now, the heartbreaking part for me at Gainesville is the University of Air Center building, the former Eastern Airlines terminal where I spent time as a little boy right up into my teens and probably even my early 20s. That building is going to be torn down in the coming years. And you know, as much as that hurts my heart, it makes sense. That building was designed and built in 1955. It was a whole different world back then. Aviation, both commercial and general and military, were entirely different than they are today. So while I'll miss the history of that building when it's gone, I appreciate that it was part of my life when it was there. It was part of my dad's life. It was part of John Allison's life. All of us had a connection to that building in that airport because we went, we participated, we had some role, whether it was as a passenger or just an observer or an active pilot. I want to encourage you to really consider getting out and getting involved in some way at your local airport, whether it's as a volunteer at their local airport day. Ask the airport director or manager, how can I be a part of this? How can I help? Because there's a long line of people who have complaints. There's a very short line of people who are willing to help. Find a way to be a part of it, and I'm telling you, your whole life will get better. That's been true for me. It's been true for my buddy Steve. It was certainly true for my dad, and John Allison made the history books because of his experiences. This is part of your life that you might not have taken seriously and you might not think of as a career-oriented goal. But getting out to your local airport, becoming a part of the community at your local airport, whether that's as a part-time line person, whether that's a participant at the EAA chapter building, and I'll bet there is one in your area, or whether you start a whole new group with a high school aero club or an adult flying club or just some type of aviation booster club. That's all possible, it's all available, and you can be the person that makes it happen. So go ahead and give it a shot right after you like this video and share it with your friends on social media, and of course subscribe to the channel. I really appreciate you tagging along. I know this was a weird story that's largely personal. It's personal to me, but if you put just the littlest bit of effort in, you're going to make your own personal story, your own history, where your own children and grandchildren will be going to that airport and say, you know who got me out here doing this? That's a pretty good story. Just wait and see.